Hello everybody. In this lesson we're going to talk about the different ways that we approach classification in biology. So biology uses two different approaches to understand how to classify an organism. So when a new organism is approached, we traditionally use the phenetic system or phenetic method. Today, in modern biology, we use a cladistic method. So this is the method we want to focus on for our studies and for any study you do in the future. The phenetic method comes from the idea of phenotype. Phenotype is the observable characteristic of an individual due to their genetics, but it is not a direct measurement of the genetics. And in fact, the phenotype was a term used to describe physical characteristics before we even understood genetics. We discuss phenotype even in the 1700s, 1800s, the observable the observable characteristics of an organism. So that's just the phenotype. So I might have a blonde hair phenotype. Someone else might have a black haired phenotype or a brown hair phenotype. That is just an observable characteristic. When we look at our previous lesson, when we talked about subspecies, we would say that polar bears have a white hair phenotype versus brown bears who have a brown hair phenotype. So that is a phenotype. It's an observable characteristic that can be used to define the species, can be used to characterize a species, but it is ultimately just that. It's just the physical characteristics. Now, as biology grew, they started to understand that the genetic characteristics were much more important because sometimes organisms might have similar genetics and look different, and other times they might have different genetics but look the same. So the phenetic method is this traditional classification method. Organisms are classified due to similarities and relationships of morphology. Morphology is another word here about the physical forms and structures. Morphology is the study of phenotypes. Let's put that in there. Study of phenotypes, or even the comparison of phenotypes. Organizing by phenotype does not show evolutionary relationships among organisms because it focuses only on the visible characteristics, not the genetics that are at its origin. So when we look at the phenetic organization of vertebrates, we might say that phylum Chordata has a subphylum Vertebra. And in this case, we would organize all fish by some of the characteristics that they have. So for example, we would have the jawless fish, we'd have the cartilaginous fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammalians. And so each of these would be equally diverse. So you can see here this animal kingdom sort of organized this way. And we're talking about this grouping right here. So the vertebrates, the fish, the birds, the amphibians, the mammals, and the reptiles are divided into groups because of their difference in appearance, their difference in characteristics, their difference in phenotypes. But the categorization is all equal. So we don't actually get to understand much other than that these organisms are different from others, and so they should be categorized that way. Now in the cladistic method, we fix some of that and we make a more sequential and telling story. So cladistic method, this uses phylogenetics as the determining factor in classifying organisms. Phylogenetics is the study of the evolutionary history and relationships among individuals or organisms or groups of organisms. In this way, they look at characteristics, but they emphasize this idea of descent and common ancestry, the idea that all organisms come from an original sort of source, or all organisms have evolved from only a few types of organisms. So all the diversity on Earth that is out there today, is actually the evolution of only a few basic organisms at the beginning of sort of Earth's biological history. So this will use things like it will use genetics, but it'll also use fossil records and geography and other pieces of evidence to group organisms together or apart based on the possibility that they are related. So to do this, they organize the organisms into clades using cladograms. So a clade is sort of a grouping of organisms based on their shared characteristics. This is different from the traditional taxa that taxonomy tends to focus on. So here's an example of how this might work. The lampreys are a type of animal we find that exists in our animal kingdom, but it lacks a jaw. Now, there are lots of animals that do have jaws, so we would look at this idea that jaws being so essential to survival that they are probably a factor that would have to develop early on and would probably not be lost by organisms over evolutionary history. Once you develop a jaw, the advantage is so great that your organisms are likely not going to those organisms are not going to evolve to not have jaws. So all organisms with jaws are placed post this jaw event, the event in time where a jaw developed. So some ancestor of the lamprey, some group of them develop jaws, or many groups of them maybe develop jaws, and then from there, some of those jawed organisms also developed lungs eventually. Now this is talking, we need to think about this in scale. We're talking about a scale of millions of years. So this can be very tricky to wrap your head around, that we are talking about millions of years going by. And so in this way, we are not, it's going to be it can be very challenging for us as human beings who are used to timescales that are much shorter than millions of years to really get in there and talk about this. But we are, we need to think about this like, actually more like almost not quite billions of years, but we're talking about millions of years for sure. And so, all right, let's go to the next one. The next one is an amniotic membrane. So this is something that's related to the egg. And so and the egg of the organism. So very much related to reproduction, and those types of characteristics are going to stick around for a long time. Or those characteristics are essential to reproduction and very difficult to lose, because losing the amniotic membrane would be an evolutionary sort of reversal. And so then we see all these organisms. So all of these organisms would have amniotic membranes. And then we start to look at some other categories like hair. All of these organisms have hair, but we do not find hair in lizards, so we separate them. Hair must have been a trait that developed post the development of the lizard ancestor. From hair, which is a feature that none of these organisms had, we also have the organization of things with and without tails. All organisms on Earth right now that have hair are arranged either into a case where they have tails or no tails, and it appears that even humans and gorillas have sort of a diminutive tail that is no longer in use. And then we have the difference, and then if we compare the gorilla and human body shape and body plan, we find that the gorilla is only differs in one major way, which is the bipedalness. And it, of course, has some traits that help it survive on all fours, but but it is generally um, similar to the human being, except for the bipedal difference. And it has the jaws, and it has the lungs, and it has the amniotic membrane, and it has hair and no tail. So in this way, we can get a sort of evolutionary relationship. We can get an idea that that in the past, the farthest past we could go in this diagram, we would have an organism that had some sort of characteristics most like a lamprey, and few characteristics that it shared with humans. Over that time, new organisms would have arrived, and those new organisms would have shared some characteristics with sharks, and a few more characteristics with humans. And then salamanders, and then lizards. So we start to see sort of the evolution of a shark-like organism, evolution uh, of uh, salamander-like organisms, then lizard-like organisms, etc., etc. And this gives us a first start at a possible evolutionary history. And of course, the science doesn't stop here. We would have to keep going and look for other ways of studying the science and figuring out if there is other clues that inform this cladogram. Possibly we would look at other data, like geographical or other things like that. But those are subjects we'll talk in another day. So this cladogram is not just based on the traits, but they can also be placed on geographic location, fossil records, genetics, geography, and other pieces of evidence. So uh, once again, they show the evolutionary relationship. They do not rank in terms of taxa, so we do not see the terminology of the phyla, the class, the order. That's all gone in the cladogram. And the organisms are organized into clades, which are groups of organisms that include an ancestor. We actually did see one of these in our previous video where we added in an image. So if I can scroll back, excuse uh, this scrolling action here. But when we looked at this bear example, this is showing also a cladogram of sorts. So there are similarities here that are being divided out. So all organisms here share some characteristics. So all of these and these share something in common with this one. And then even looking at the raccoon and the lesser panda, they share some characteristics. So they are placed in a similar clade together, and then the clade divides and divides and divides based on the shared characteristics between the organisms. Okay, I'm going to slide back just 1 second. All right. So as you slide through this, you'll see that the vertebrates can be divided out this way now. So here is a much more thorough development of the vertebrates, and we start to see some divisions of some of those classes that we discussed in the previous. So in the taxonomy division, we had the Aganantha, and that included hagfish and lampreys. But here we actually notice there's a difference that they don't have. There's a difference in the type of vertebrate that they have. Furthermore, we can see that something like in the tetrapoda here, that's the four-legged organisms, we have the example of the examples of frogs and salamanders, and these organisms here, those are all of our sort of amphibia, are very much separate from the turtles, alligators, and crocodilians. But we also see this interesting little piece here where the aves, the birds, are actually very closely related to crocodilia. They share more characteristics than we might have pictured because birds are very different, obviously, than crocodiles. But even though they have lots of differences physically, they actually share a lot of historical or genetic similarities. They share fossil record similarities. They share genetic similarities and markers that we don't see between, say, birds and mammals. The differences between birds and mammals are huge, but the differences between the birds and the crocodile is actually very small. So that sort of gives us a map as to when did birds arrive? What was the organism that led to the formation of birds? Of course, some of you might be aware that that organism would have been dinosaur. And dinosaur fit in here somewhere. So that kind of gives you a timeline. Crocodiles and dinosaurs existed at the same time frame. So this is about, this difference here. This time is about 65 million years or so. So that's that idea there. So note the division of amniota away from the traditional amphibians. This places mammals and reptiles as more closely related than to amphibians, and we also see that crocodilia and aves share more characteristics than other reptiles to crocodiles. So actually crocodiles aren't even, so oddly enough, birds and lizards which you might think of lizards having some similarity to birds, maybe less so than the crocodiles. Would have thought. They actually don't. If we really break down the fossil evidence, the biochemical evidence, the genetic evidence, the morphology, we would now be led to believe that reptiles and birds share these commonalities, and crocodiles and birds share even more commonalities. So to summarize, biologists organize and use classification systems to help understand living organisms, and these schemes or schema for classifying organisms continue to change with increasing knowledge. This type of organization, this phylogenetic clade, is one that is debated at biological conferences or over papers, and papers are written about these things, and the opinions in them do change occasionally. So you do have to stay up to date on these sort of things, but the changes are always slight and always interesting. Anyways, hope you found this interesting, and we will talk to you again in the next video. Have a great day.